Hello, I am Percio Castro from Nibble Technologies, and today we're continuing with our series of demos around Otelscope. In our previous video, we set up our environment by cloning the demo GitHub repository, and then we built the necessary Docker images. We're now ready to run the demo. As a quick recap, in this demo, we'll be pushing HTTP requests to the Web Methods platform via a Postman collection, and we'll be using Otelscope to automatically monitor the execution of those services and to automatically push traces, metrics, and logs to an OpenTelemetry Collector configured to export that information to local files. So let's see it in action. Alright, so now we're back inside of Visual Studio Code. As you may recall from the end of the last video, we called the build.bat script to build some Docker images that we need for our demo environment. So those Docker images were the API gateway image, universal messaging, and the microservices runtime. Now these are the same images that you can pull down from the SoftwareG container registry, and in fact that's what we're doing, but we're also adding some license files to these containers as well as installing Otelscope inside of the API gateway and MSR images. Now, before we can spin up this environment, I just want to do a quick recap. If we take a look at the OpenTelemetry Collector configuration file, you will see that we're going to be writing traces, metrics, and logs to these three files. Now, the directory that these files are being written to is also being mapped to a local directory using Docker Compose. So if I look at the Docker Compose file, you see that that directory is being mapped to a directory right here under the Otel folder. So as soon as we spin up this environment and we start pumping data into the OpenTelemetry Collector via Otelscope, we should see that information getting captured here inside this folder. Alright, so let's go ahead and spin up this environment. So just like before, where we had a build.bat script to help us build the environment, we also have another script that's going to help us spin up this environment. So we're going to run this script right now, and it's called up.bat. Now, once I launch the script, you will see that it's going to create and start 5 containers for me. The MSR, Newman, OpenTelemetry Collector, API Gateway, and Universal Messaging. Now, before I can start pumping data into the API Gateway, I want to make sure that the MSR and the API Gateway are up and running. There are a few different ways that we can do that. The easiest is probably just to monitor the logs. So I can do that either via the wrapper script that I have here, and I can follow the MSR logs. Or if you have Docker Desktop installed, you can also do it from there. So if I switch to Docker Desktop, and I take a look at my MSR container, I can also monitor the logs from here. So as you can see, the MSR is currently starting. Alright, so it looks like the MSR is finally up. So I want to highlight a couple of things here. One of the coolest things that you will see right away is that when the MSR comes up and Otelscope is installed, you will see a trace ID and span ID automatically inserted into every log event that goes into the server log. So this is going to help us correlate these log events with traces and metrics and other things that we're shipping via Otelscope to the OpenTelemetry Collector and eventually to the target, whatever APM tool we decide to use. And for this demo, we're just shipping that information to local files. Now, the other thing that you're seeing here is that our MSR is now waiting for the API gateway to start. The reason why it's doing that is because the NT demo package wants to register its API automatically with the API gateway, and that's why you see this message saying waiting for IS running on APIG:5555 to start. So while we wait for the API gateway to start, how about we take a look at the administration console of the MSR so we can see what's installed there. So I'm going to switch over to my browser, and I'm going to log into my MSR. And if I switch over to packages, you will see all the packages that we talked about being installed on the MSR. So the NT common package has the instrumentation agent. NT demo contains the API that we're actually hitting for this demo. NT Otel logs allows services to emit log events directly to the OpenTelemetry Collector. And NT Otelscope is the workhorse that's actually capturing the traces, metrics, logs, and emitting them to the OpenTelemetry Collector. Now, as you may recall, we have a configuration file in the background called otelscope.cfg that had several parameters that we could configure. You can also configure those directly here via the Otelscope configuration page. So if you switch over here to the Otelscope configuration screen, you will see all of those things that you can configure for Otelscope. And not only that, all of these items are fully documented here on the screen itself. Now, we'll create another video in the future that goes through this page in detail and actually explains what each one of these items are and how they can be used to tailor your experience with Otelscope. But for the time being, just know that Otelscope is highly configurable and you can tailor it to your needs. All right, switching back to Docker Desktop now. Let's see if the API gateway is now up and running, and it looks like it is. So we connected to the IS running on the API gateway successfully. That means that if we go back to the API gateway now and we take a look at the APIs that are currently registered there, we should see our Nibble demo API there, and there it is. Now, what is this Nibble demo API pointing to? Well, it's pointing to this REST API descriptor. Now, this REST API descriptor exists inside of the NT demo package. Again, before I start pumping data, I want you guys to get familiar with it so you understand what's happening behind the scenes. So let's take a quick look at that package in Designer. All right, so now we're in Designer, and we're going to take a look at this NT demo package. If I drill down all the way to that API descriptor and then look at the services that are actually being invoked when that API descriptor is hit, the post order service is the top level service. Now, this service is going to accept an order as input, and then it's going to log a message to the server log saying the order was received. And then finally, it's going to publish the order. Now, on the other side of the publish, we have a trigger that's going to receive the order, and then it's going to call the process order service. This process order service is going to do things like checking for duplicates, it's going to log some messages, and it's also going to emit some metrics to Otelscope, but we're not going to get into that quite yet. We'll perhaps down the line for a future demo. But just know that this service is doing things that we want to capture as traces from Otelscope so we can see the end-to-end execution of that API request from the time it enters the API gateway to the time it comes into the MSR, goes to universal messaging, comes back, and then of course the response being sent back to the requester itself. All right, so that's the demo package. So let's pump some data through it. So as we talked about before, we want to use Newman to pump data using a Postman collection. So I'm going to come back here to Visual Studio Code, and just like we have before, we're going to use a wrapper script to launch that container and start pumping data through it. As you may guess, the wrapper script is data.bat. So this script is going to launch the Newman container, and it's going to provide the name of the collection that we're trying to run and how many requests we want to send and how much time to wait between requests. So let's go ahead and start doing that, and we'll go back to monitoring the logs to see what happens when that starts being submitted. All right, so I'm running data.bat, which is posting those requests behind the scenes using the Newman container, and I'm going to switch again to my Docker desktop. And now we see the orders coming into the MSR. So my Newman container is running, it's posting requests to the API gateway. The API gateway is now sending those requests into the MSR, and the MSR is doing all the things that we're talking about. So for each order, the order is being published, and on the other side we're checking for duplicates, and if the order is validated, we map it, and then we persist it, etc. All right, so that's cool. So now what? What does this mean from an OpenTelemetry standpoint? So as you may recall, all of this data that's coming across the API gateway and the MSR and all the metrics associated with it are being tracked by Otelscope and then are getting shipped to the OpenTelemetry Collector. And the OpenTelemetry Collector, in turn, should be collecting this data now into our targets, which are 3 files for traces, metrics, and logs. So if I grab one of these trace IDs from the log, so let's go ahead and grab any of these. How about that one? I should be able to now go back to my log files, and as you may recall, I told you that the logs directory was going to be mapped right here, and there it is. And I should be able to find the traces associated for those requests right here. So if I go to the traces file now, you'll see that it has a bunch of information. So these are all the service invocations that are happening on the MSR as well as on the API gateway. Now, This is a lot of gibberish, right? So these are JSON objects. We can try to make it a little better for us to see. So let's go ahead and format the document so we can see this file a little more easily. But now let's look for that trace ID that I mentioned before. So if I paste that trace ID in here, I can now see that entire trace for that one request. So you can see the request coming into the gateway client service. It then goes through the API gateway until it's fed over to the MSR. So here's that debug log that we saw in the MSR. It gets published, and then you will see it calling the publish order service, calling the clear pipeline service, the post order service, get order IDs, check for duplicates. So now we're already on the subscriber. So you can see the entire trace from end to end, no matter how many hops it takes, how many times it goes to UM and comes back. You can see the entire trace end to end until the end of the process order service is called. Now, the coolest thing about this is that along with the information about what service is getting invoked, you also get all metrics related to when the service started, when the service completed, how much time was used from the CPU, what thread ID, the root context ID of the integration server, and this can actually get enriched with even more information as needed. Now, in addition to the traces themselves, we can find metrics in the metrics file. Again, we'll format this to make it a little easier for us to see, but there are several metrics that you will find here, things here like CPU threads, along with some other things. For example, JVM memory committed, and we can keep looking for these to find even more interesting metrics. Obtainable memory, memory committed, memory used, initial memory requested, CPU usage, service statistics, JVM runtime, etc. So all these are things that Otelscope is automatically tracking and submitting to the OpenTelemetry Collector for us. Now, last but not least, we talked about logs. All the events being written to the server log, as well as events being emitted via the NTOTel logs package, are now being consolidated, aggregated into this one location. So perhaps if you have a single integration server running, this doesn't seem like a big deal. But if you have a large cluster of integration servers or a fairly complex environment that involves API gateways, universal messaging, integration servers, and even non-web methods servers, it adds extreme value to be able to collect all that information, all those logs in a central location, so that you can actually correlate different log events for the same trace or even for different traces that share a similar component, for example. You can correlate them in one place. So again, here we can actually format this document to make it a little easier for us to see. But you can see information here about the order being inserted into the DB and etc. So I can even search again for that same trace ID, and now I can see events for that trace ID right here that were emitted to the log right here in the OpenTelemetry Collector target file. Now, this is a lot of information, a lot of data being captured currently into JSON files, and no reasonable human being would actually try to read through these files or parse through these files themselves, which is where those powerful APM tools come into play. So rather than exporting the metrics, traces, and logs to files, it usually makes sense to export them to a target that's actually going to parse this data, and it's going to present them in a way that is appealing and useful to the end customer. So that's what we're going to get into in our next videos. So hopefully you guys tune back in, and we're going to explore how to export some of this data to APM providers that most of our customers already have in place, like New Relic, Datadog, Grafana, etc. So please tune back in, and I hope to see you again. Take care.